Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our medieval unit in the humanities class. Today, what I'm gonna really definitely do is actually finish the Divine Comedy. We had to cut it short last time for timing reasons, but this time now that we're done with the Inferno, we're going to turn to Purgatory and Paradise. So we're gonna finish the Divine Comedy today. Now, last time we ended with the descent of Dante, culminating in his meeting with Satan, if you want to call it a meeting at all. So he meets with Satan and he kind of travels past Satan. And in doing so, he then comes out on the other side of the kind of structure that Dante has set up. And when he does emerge from this other side out of hell, he emerges at the base of the mountain of Purgatory or Purgatorio. Now, purgatory as a concept here is an important thing for us to comprehend because purgatory is one of those things that is used quite often in a lot of popular culture and a lot of popular diction, a lot of popular phrasing. But we, as usual, when doing those sort of things, we kind of miss the actual meaning of what purgatory is in the medieval Catholic and even the present day Catholic mentality. Now, the structure of purgatory, we got to do the same thing that we basically did with the Inferno here. The structure of purgatory is as follows. It is 7 terraces ascending up a mountain towards the Garden of Eden, said to be made from the earth that sprang up when Satan fell. Okay. So place, direction, all this kind of stuff. Let's talk about this. So the significance of being in this direction, place, and shape. Okay, let's start with direction. It is ascending. Okay, so we have, in some sense, the inversion of what we saw in the Inferno. We are ascending now. We are not descending. We are getting closer and closer now to the divine reality, to the ultimate reality, to the source of goodness, life, joy, all this sort of thing. It is in the place where that is essentially in the opposite of where Satan falls. So if you look at it like a globe like this, Satan falls, he makes the crater, and the debris from that crater then forms the mountain of purgatory. I'm sorry, the mountain of purgatory. So in some sense, I think Dante is saying, it is from the wounds, it is from the broken material that we lost, essentially, that we are now going to be able to try to get closer to God. We are going to have to ascend towards heaven. And, being marred earth, being something that is tainted in its own way, we're going to have to kind of purge ourselves of our sins as we go up and up and up this mountain. Now, why terraces? Why towards the Garden of Eden? Well, first of all, I think we should notice that it is not something that is described as a circle. It's a terrace, right? So it's not a sphere, it's not a circle. It's kind of, again, getting a little bit more multi-dimensional here. This is not something that is flat and basic and kind of compressed to the ground and close to the ground and less real in its dimensions, like we saw in the Inferno. Now, why getting closer and closer towards the Garden of Eden? Well, I think what is kind of going on here is, again, kind of mirroring the cone shape that we saw in hell. But I think the meaning of this particular symbolism is a little bit different because, again, that one was kind of going down. It was descending and shrinking, whereas this one is also kind of, it's ascending, but it's also shrinking towards the top. Well, why? I think what Dante is sort of saying is, or giving us an image of what Jesus would have referred to in the New Testament as the straight and narrow path. It is this notion that the pathway to truly good, honest, wholesome, moral, loving living is a narrow path, right? There are many ways that we can go wrong. There are many ways that we can go astray, and there's really just one right way that we can go about things. Now, that's again a typical spiritual truth in the Christian religion and a lot of religions, honestly, but it's one that the Christians obviously really articulate quite often, and as Dante is showing, articulate, or not just articulated, but depict as well. So why the Garden of Eden then? Well, when we get there, we'll discuss more about that. Why is it that we need to pass through the Garden of Eden in some sense in order to enter paradise, or go through it to enter paradise? So before we jump in and start looking at the terraces here, because there are 7, each one corresponding with one of the deadly sins, it is important to understand 2 things. What does the term purgatory mean? What is its function in the afterlife? And why are there 7 deadly sins? What are these 7 deadly sins meant to kind of represent, or meant to correspond to? What is it that they really are here to do? So the notion of purgatory in our popular culture is usually associated more with something in the medieval Catholic perspective, or even in the Catholic theological perspective, is usually conflated with something like limbo. We in our culture refer to purgatory as something negative. It's like, oh, I'm going to be stuck in purgatory. I'm going to be trapped in this eternal purgatory. I'm going to have to spend this many years in purgatory, all this kind of stuff. Underlying all that is a negative connotation. It's like, oh, that would be a bad thing. This is negative. It's like I'm trapped. That betrays, ladies and gentlemen, a fundamental misunderstanding of what purgatory is in this particular culture's theology. Purgatory, as you can even hear in the name, is a place of purging. It is where souls need to kind of purge off the last remnants, the last residue of their sins before they are able to enter into heaven. So you can use a couple different metaphors there. The metaphor that I was usually given when I was learning about this stuff was, it's essentially kind of like a bathhouse before heaven, where you need to clean yourself up before the wedding feast, right? You need to make yourself a little bit more cleanly, a little bit more presentable, so that we can actually see the full beauty of you, essentially. We need to get rid of all the muck, all the filth off of us. We need to clean your hair up, shave your your face, make your clothes a little bit more presentable, all this kind of stuff. That is what purgatory is sort of getting at. Other metaphors, describe it as like you need to essentially clear yourself out and hone your nature, or kind of widen your nature, so that you can actually accept, or kind of take in the full joy of heaven, or something like that. I personally think the metaphor that sort of sticks in my head as the more fundamental, or the more kind of appropriate one, is a place of growth. Essentially, it is a place where you need to go through a few stages of growth. It is like a training ground to learn, to have a little bit of post-mortem education before you can really enter into heaven and enter into a full relationship. That's essentially how Catholics will think about it. And they'll usually, if you talk to a really devout Catholic, they'll usually refer to it as something similar to like premarital, what's the phrase? I think it's like pre-cana or something like that. All my Catholics can correct me about this. But essentially like a counseling or a spiritual direction that you go through with the church and with the priest, with your wife or your husband before you get married, so that you're prepared and you can be a better spouse, in a better relationship with your husband or wife. So it's kind of like couple counseling, in that sense, where you really need to get yourself ready, or get yourself prepared for this, the joys of this relationship that's going to come. Now, whatever metaphor you pick, you can see that underneath it all, and Dante highlights this in his epic poem, or his poem rather, that the connotation of purgatory, ladies and gentlemen, it should be as something positive. It's something good. It is, if you are, again, using just basic kind of spiritual physics and logic here, it technically would be a better experience than being on Earth, actually. So people say, "Oh, I'm going to be trapped in purgatory. I'm going to be stuck in purgatory." It's like that's theoretically it's better than being here. It's like it's a better deal, because it'll be better. You're technically closer to God. You're technically closer to goodness in life. So it's better. Now, why 7 terraces? Well, they correspond, like we said, to the 7 deadly sins. Well, what are the 7 deadly sins? We're going to go through each one here. And I think what Dante is doing here is demonstrating to us a couple things, again, about Christian and Catholic theology, which is that in hell, we had people punished for not merely being sinful, in the sense that they have a broken nature, they have a sinful nature, like we already know that the Christians believe we all do. So everybody has the seven deadly sins. It's like that's just kind of an inherent disease that we all carry in our soul. Again, the Christians believe that our soul is made in the image of God, is beloved by God, and all this kind of stuff is essentially good in its nature and its existence, but has been corrupted, has been kind of tainted by this disease, this diseased nature called sin. And in the Inferno, I think what you see a little bit, although I'm pretty sure Dante and Virgil don't articulate this, but in hell, you see more of people who not just had that internal nature, but almost like acted it out more intentionally. So, it's not, as we're going to see here, for example, you're going to see in the the terraces of purgatory, people who have these internal flaws, like lust, or like what would be the better example, like anger. But you're going to see, or wrath, it should be phrased as. But in the Inferno, you're going to see people who actually acted wrathfully, acted violently, all this kind of stuff. That's going to be how we make a distinction here. So the people in purgatory, or those of us in purgatory, as we kind of track our own journey through this particular narrative, might just be struggling with it as an internal problem, like it's something we need to get over, something we need to purge ourselves of. That's kind of how you need to understand at least part of the Divine Comedy here. Now, what we're going to do is, again, similar to what we did with the Inferno, although it's a little bit easier here in some sense, because we're going to track the terrors, track the sin, describe to us what the purging method is, what again, the metaphorical depiction of the purging process looks like, and what is the symbolic significance of this, okay? We have a couple of questions at the end, but let's get through the major ones. Now, we begin at the base of purgatory, of Mount Purgatory, and therefore it has to be the grandest or the heaviest or the foundation, if you want, of all other sins or of all other dysfunctions that we see later on in the story. Now, the particular sin that Dante articulates here, or that Dante places here, is something that should be very familiar to us as humanities students. It is the sin of pride. It is the sin of hubris. Okay? Now, why is this familiar to us? We talked about this in our universal materials video. We talked about this in a couple different parts of our Greek myths, that arrogance and hubris and pride, whatever phrase you want to use, is essentially viewed as the foundation, as the root of all other sins. It is the one from which all other sins grow. Well, why? Good question here. What is it that's so bad about being prideful? We saw, again, the more graphic metaphorical depiction of this in the bottom of the Inferno in the form of Lucifer, in the form of Satan, rather, as someone who has completely tried to make themselves the center of reality and elevate their value above the value of all other things. Now, that's a very technical and complex way of describing what pride is. But we can sit here for a while and sort of discuss what that actually looks like in practice when we see people acting or behaving or sort of implying that they are more important, that they are smarter, that they are better in any way, shape, or form. Or I shouldn't say any way, shape, or form, but in deep sense of actual personal value, that they are better than other people, and that they deserve more attention, or that they deserve more focus than other people. And even to the degree that they are more important than God in this particular religion. That is why I think it was C.S. Lewis in his big apologetic work on Christianity describes pride as the great sin, right? It is the sin that is the most or it embodies, or it kind of exemplifies the most anti-God type of sin. It is the ultimate anti-God state of mind, as he says, I think. So one way to understand this, if you want to kind of break out and look at this in a little bit more of a less religious context, is narcissism, is self-focus, is selfishness. It's people who just think that they are more important than others. Now, as you can see, that essentially gets in the way of any relationship that you want to have, even a proper relationship with yourself, because pride is something that is essentially not true, right? It's not true. Like you're this idea that you are actually that important above anybody else and that others are not important. That's just not true. That's a fundamental misconception, a misperception of reality. So in that sense, you'll never actually have a proper relationship with yourself if you really are that prideful, because you are not allowing yourself to be honest about who you are in relationship to other people. And you won't ever actually be able to have a truly loving relationship, because your love is going to be so, and love should be in scare quotes there, your your attention, your focus is so curved in on yourself. Again, referring back to that notion of curvatus and se from our first video on Dante. It's just all focused on you. And as you're going to see, every sin from here on out is colored by that central theme of focusing on the self. It's about me. It's me, I, constantly. I remember that I was in a class once, or I think it was a class or like a reading club or something like that. Yeah, it was a reading club, and we were discussing a lot of these things. We were discussing, classic literature and all this kind of stuff. And we had just one kid in the group that every single, every single question about what the problem with a character was, what the problem with a particular person's dysfunction was, he would just say every single time, "It's pride. It's pride. It's always pride." I don't think the kid was Catholic, but he was very much drawing on this, not just Catholic, but this universal uh, focus. I mean, like every religion, every particular worldview, every functional, like psychological field, every psychological philosophy and school of thought, every functional philosophy also condemns this as just one of the most toxic, if not the most toxic trait that could ever be in your personality, be in your soul, be in your mind, whatever you want to call it. So Dante, again, very much in tune with all of that, puts it at the foundation, as the foundation stone of all other sins. Okay, sure, that's what pride is. What is the actual punishment? People are forced, or what is the purging method, I should say? People who are prideful are forced to do what? They are forced to carry boulders up this terrace. And these boulders press them closer and closer to the ground. Okay. Now, I think the imagery there is pretty obvious. You are being forced into humility. You are being broken down. You are being shown that there are things that you are much weaker than you think you are. It is also, in its direction, bring you closer and closer to the earth. It is bringing you, as our language says, down to earth. It is making you more humble, more close to that symbol of humility, of truth. So in this sense, I think Dante once again is showing a little bit of brilliance here, because he's pointing out, like, yeah, you have this elevated, this inflated view of yourself that is not close to accurate at all. And so you need to be brought into contact with more concrete reality and really see who you are in relationship to that. Okay. Now, a couple things. As we move up the terraces, we usually, I didn't put this in the notes, but it's a good thing to notice, is that Dante will give us or will discuss with us kind of a Marian example, a counterexample to pride. And and being a good Catholic, he sees Mary in the Bible, in the New Testament, as the exemplary human being in terms of a relationship with God. So he basically is looking at her, looking at examples of Mary in each terrace and saying, like, okay, look at what she's doing. And that's kind of how we should be acting there. I bring that up as kind of an introduction to this point of understanding a Catholic view of femininity and a Catholic, love of femininity, or this infatuation with femininity. The Catholics in the medieval era, again, depending on who you're talking to, but I would say generally, as a rule, in artwork and in literature, and Dante is no exception here, generally they view women as more virtuous, or as easier to depict in a virtuous light than men. Men are usually associated with a lot of these sins and a lot of these errors, whereas it's usually the women who are, associated with something a little bit closer to virtue. The virtues have a feminine gender to them. The actual the words of the virtues have feminine gender, and the notion of Mary's role in the Catholic religion really kind of pushes that even further. It says, like, yeah, look at all of the female saints, look at the Virgin Mary, look at the Mother of God, like all this kind of stuff. There's something inherently, it seems, more sanctifying in the feminine nature. And the Marian example in this terrace, if I'm remembering correctly, is when Mary says to God, "Let it be done to me according to thy will." In other words, she essentially allows herself to become the mother of Jesus and says, yes, I consent to this. I consent to God's will. So her submission, if you want to use that kind of language, her submission to God's will, her putting herself below the authority of God, is essentially what Dante points out as like the easy example of how to be more humble, essentially, how to be more humble. Okay, so that's terrace one. Terrace two is for those of us who are envy. Now, what is envy exactly? It is when we, described often as kind of like the sister or the cousin of pride. It is when we see someone else having something and we are dismaying at this. We are angry about this. Notice what I'm saying there. It's not simply seeing somebody has something and then me saying, oh, I would want that too. Like, oh, I see somebody who has good friends, has a good marriage, and I kind of want that too. I want that as well. That's not envy. That's not envy at all. Oh, I see someone who's really, really skilled. Wow, that's awesome. I want to be skilled like that too. That is not envy. Envy is when you see someone have something and you're like, like I wish they didn't have that, essentially, or I wish I could take that from them. That's envy, okay? So it's when you are like dismayed that your friends make more money than you, or you're angry that someone is smarter or demonstrating more knowledge than you. That is when you have this kind of envy sort of brewing in you, right? So Dante says what? This terrace filled with envious souls. Their lives were spent desiring what others made happy to the point where they were harmed themselves. The problem with this, yada yada yada. Penitence, where gray cloaks and cannot see where they are going because their eyes have been closed and sewn with their wire. Okay, good. So you're forced to wear gray, kind of drab clothes. In other words, a little bit less vain, and you are forced to have your eyes sewn shut. So stop gawking at what everyone else has. Stop focusing on what everyone else has. Focus on what you have been given. That's kind of what I think he's getting at there, and what the basic symbolism is there. Okay, so envy. All right, now as we get to this next one, angry. Yeah, it should say anger. It should say wrath, by the way, not anger. I'm gonna fix this. Something you'll notice, by the way, very important point, is just like in the Inferno, the danger of the sin, the deadliness of these sins, becomes less and less severe. All right. So in the Inferno, the further down, right, it's the further away from God that we're getting, the closer to Satan we're getting. So the worse the sins get, the further down we go. The equation is flipped in Purgatory because we are starting low and we are going closer and closer and closer to God. So the sins get less and less and less deadly. Still deadly, still bad, but less and less so. Now, I wonder if my students could see this pattern here, because you have pride, you have envy, you have wrath. And as we're going to see once we get to the next couple sins, they become more and more fixated on earthly things, on actual kind of like desires, and less just internal sort of things that affect our relationships. What I think Dante is brilliantly focusing on there is that sins, the first three or four of the seven deadly sins, are the deadliest because they are basically in relationship to our ability to have relationships. They are internal sins. They are soulful sins, right? So, like, jumping ahead, we know that lust is going to be the top at the top of the terrace. It's going to be the least deadly of the seven deadly sins. Well, why? Why is lust so much less severe than something like pride? Well, because as you can probably see, pride just permeates all of your relationships, all of the way you look at everything. Envy, is a deep-seated kind of like anti-loving, anti-charitable way of looking at the world. Anger, as we're going to see, or wrath, is the same thing, right? It really is a poison. It's a resentment of all things, of all people. Whereas like lust, it's like an abundance of an appetite for something, right? You have this like overwhelming like abundance of this desire for something, but there's not necessarily any like you know I don't want to say any, but there's less of a dysfunctional kind of nature to it. It's less severe, and like the way that I usually articulate it to my students and the way that they articulate it back to me is that okay, you have this really overwhelming kind of desire to have a sexual relationship in some way, shape, or form. It's like okay, yeah, like most people can sympathize with that, but like, are you a narcissist? And so it's like, who would you rather be friends with? Who would you rather be married to? Who would you rather have in your family? Someone who has this very overwhelming desire, and it maybe causes them to see people in not a very healthy way, and they need to work on that. And it's like, yikes, okay. Versus someone who's just a narcissist and just is like, no, I'm the most important thing in the world, and you all are a bunch of idiots compared to me. You're all a bunch of useless and tools for me. It's like clearly that one is so much more toxic. The lust thing is still bad, it's still toxic, you want to get rid of it. But these internal things, these things that are just, at the foundation of our understanding about reality and relationships are just so much worse, right? So that's why I usually describe it as like, like heart cancer. It's like just something just so pervasive, and it's going to just destroy everything in your life, not just the kind of sexual dimension of your life, or the food or the money dimension of your life, as we're going to see. It's something that's going to affect everything, right? It's going to just destroy everything in your life. So you kind of can make that easy divide between the really internal, like spiritual seven deadly sins versus the more carnal and earthly seven deadly sins and the seven deadly sins. That's, I think, what Dante is doing here. Okay, with all that being said, why is wrath a sin? What is wrath? It is not anger, and that's why I changed this, because old me wrote it in here as anger, and most students, if they see that, they will walk away from Dante thinking, oh, okay, well, therefore it's a sin to ever be angry or show anger about anything. And then you might think, wait a minute, isn't God angry in the Old Testament? Aren't the prophets angry sometimes? Isn't Jesus like get really angry at times? Well, yeah. So, well, that's okay because he's God. No, like I think what's going on here is a misunderstanding of what it is that's bad about anger. Anger in and of itself, again, through this kind of medieval Catholic and even contemporary Catholic understanding, is a normal thing. And I shouldn't say it's a normal thing. It is a proper response. Let's put it that way. It is a normal response to something bad in the world. For example, if you see someone being treated unfairly and you have a sense of anger in you that rises up, that is normal, that is good. That is called righteous anger, right? You have anger over the presence of something that is wrong, that needs to be corrected, all this kind of stuff. So like the anger of a civil rights leader, right? The anger of someone who's trying to, of someone who's like sees someone trying to harm their family, all this kind of stuff, right? That's how we need to understand anger. That's good, right? So when God gets angry, it's usually at something very, very unjust. When Jesus gets angry, it's usually about something very dysfunctional that he sees around him and he wants to correct. However, you can see the problem is that that's fine, right? You should have a proper amount of anger. Well, what happens when it becomes improper? What happens when it goes over the line? When you get too angry about something, and then it starts to, harm other people around you, it starts to get out of control. It turns then into what is called wrath, and it becomes resentful, right? You start to hate things. You won't let go of something, right? Like we saw with Satan in the bottom of the Inferno, right? He will not let go of what Judas and Brutus and Cassius have done. You gnaw on these old resentments. You don't forgive. You just kind of stew in your anger. So wrath in that sense would be like, okay, someone has harmed me, and it's like, I'm angry about that. Right, you should be angry about that because that is not good. You should not be treated that way. They should not be engaging in that sort of behavior. But you should be angry about it insofar that is righteous, and insofar as it's going to help you reconcile that relationship and right those wrongs. Then you should let it go. Then there should be no more anger. to hold on to it then because it feels good or because you just want the person to suffer. That is wrath, essentially. And notice again that root of pride. It is me, it is what you have done to me. I don't want to let go of it. I want to keep gnawing on it. Okay. I want you to suffer, all this kind of stuff. That self-focused, over the top sort of reaction with anger, that is wrath. Okay. So what happens here? As you can see, it's people who are forced to kind of fight their way and kind of pass through billowing and suffocating smoke, essentially. And it is essentially that very easy kind of psychological parallel here, where you are choked by your own anger. You can't even see properly. You can't even breathe properly. It clouds all of your understanding, all of your perception, and you need to basically pass through that. You need to fight through that and get over this nonsense that you just will not let go of. Okay, that's what I think is going on here. Now, number four, Terrace 4, is curiously the middle between the middle point of the seven deadly sins. And it's slothful, right? It's the slothfulness. Now, one of perhaps the most misunderstood of the seven deadly sins is this one, the sloth. Because of course people think of sloth and they think, oh, it's just, you're being a bum, you're being a couch potato, you're being lazy. Not entirely, no. Okay. Yes, that's bad. Yes, that's, I think, what Dante's getting at. But what I think in a deeper sense is going on here is that it's not that you're lazy and entirely apathetic. It's that you are apathetic about things, the certain category of things that you should not be apathetic about. So, for example, if we are discussing, let's take the religious example here, like if you're talking to Catholics and Christians and all this kind of stuff, if you're talking about, you know, the the love and adoration of God, charity towards the poor, trying to sanctify your own life, trying to be a better person, trying to be less sinful, if you're talking about these things, in the desire to be closer to, your loved ones and God and all this kind of stuff. And if you're, presented with those subjects and your attitude is kind of like, nah, you're kind of like, whatever, not interested. I'm kind of just doing my own thing. I'm not really, that doesn't really interest me at all. That is sloth. If someone comes to you and is like, hey, would you like to, maybe do something about this really big and deep problem, like in our relationship or in our family or in our friend group or in our neighborhood or in society, all this kind of stuff. Would you like to try to, maybe address this a little bit with me? Do you think that this is pretty bad? And your attitude towards that is, nah, you're kind of like, whatever. I have no real deep interest in that, no real energy about that. That is sloth. It is the lack of care about things that really should be cared about, right? That you really should have a lot of zeal towards. Okay. Like, come on, like you like, this is so obviously something that's important. How can you have no emotions about this? How can you have no real energy going on about this or interest in it? Okay. That's what sloth is. Now, the people here, I love this one, are forced to run. They are forced to, physically enact some zeal instead of kind of just moping and just kind of like slowly trotting their way in a stagnant sort of way through life. It's like, no, dude, like, come on, like, let's go. Like, have a little bit of energy, have a little bit of passion, a little bit of zeal for what you're doing. And that is, that's paralleled by, I think, Dante's Marian example, where he describes or he uses the phrase, or he quotes the phrase that she went in haste. Like whenever Mary is given a mission, or when she was given a mission in the Gospel of Luke, the text says that she goes on that mission in haste, right? She's ready to go. She's on fire for it. Like, let's do it, man. That's kind of what we're going at here. Now, why is this one in the middle? Because it's the like lukewarm sort of sin, right? It's the one that's kind of just like neutral, stagnant, right? So yeah, still negative, still very deadly. Now, greed. Okay, so we've passed the middle point now. We're getting now to the more earthly sins, the ones that are usually corresponding to something physical in the world. Okay. So Dante and Virgil, okay, another typo. This is great. Dante and Virgil see people who are greedy here, and what their particular punishment is that they are forced to lie on the floor face down with their hands and feet bound together, okay, being punished and purged for desiring material goods and extravagance and ambition. So what is greed exactly? It is the unhealthy desire. It is the unnecessary desire for things which you do not need to the lessening, essentially, or to the exclusion of others' needs, essentially. So if you are dragonish, right, in your hoarding of money, I want money, I want more money, I want more money, and I am loath to give it up. And I am more interested in collecting it, right? And you are slow to give it up. That is kind of what we're getting at with greed here, where and I think that what comes to my mind is the story of Prince Prospero in The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, which we'll read in 10th grade. You have a figure who is Prospero, right? He's prosperous. He has a lot of material wealth, a lot of extravagant, abundance in his life, and yet he shares it with no one, right? He has no desire to share it with anybody. He chooses to keep it away from all those who truly need it, and he chooses to just revel in it himself and continue to collect more from others, right? That's greed, essentially. So it's material extravagance and excess, material goods, right? What's the significance of the punishment here? You're lying in the dirt. Okay, you learn to be content in the dirt. So going back to humility, right? You're learning to be content with having essentially nothing, having essentially no materials. You're kind of enacting the impoverished position here. Okay, that's I think what Dante's getting at in this situation. Now, gluttony, right? The unhealthy desire for hunger and thirst, while there are, like when your desires, your thirsts and hungers and appetites are unnaturally kind of specific and unnaturally the focus of your attention, and again to the exclusion of other virtues and other people. Okay. Now, to move a little quicker here, what these guys are punished with is the same thing that Tantalus in the Greek stories are punished with. These people are forced to essentially, have to have beautiful fruit dangling from a tree, and they're trying to grasp at it, but they're not allowed to get it. Right, it's just out of reach, so they're needing to essentially learn to conquer their desires. They need to conquer their appetites, and learn to fast, for lack of a better word. They need to learn how to give up those desires. And then finally, the lustful, right? The lustful, again, being the least of the seven deadly sins. A good note as to why, and again, this usually surprises my students, because for whatever reason, probably as a residue of puritanical culture, we have this notion. A lot of my students come to Dante with this notion of like, wait a minute, well, I thought sexual sins were the worst sins. We're like, that's like what's in your head. And I usually say, well, that's also because because of the Protestants, like puritanical sort of culture. It's also probably because we're at an age where hormones are going kind of nuts. So fine, like I get that sex is kind of at the forefront of everyone's mind, and therefore when it comes into conflict with religion, sure, but it's not the most deadly sin. It's very clearly articulated as not the deadly sin in the medieval Catholic understanding, or in the normal spiritual understanding. Lust is a deadly sin. It is bad. We'll talk about why in a minute, but the mere, like we discussed in our religions unit when we discuss Judaism and Christianity, these are very sexually affirming religions. They say sex is good, the sexual embrace is good, the affection and love that is experienced and intimacy that is experienced in a sexual union is very, very good. The more Christians that you read, the more you realize that they actually say that it's not just good, it's holy. It's like the physical icon of God itself. So it's, again, like sex is not a bad thing. When it becomes bad, as we're going to see here, is when it is divorced from love and is divorced from the value of the person you're doing it with. That's when it's bad. So what actually is lust, therefore? Lust is not just an overabundance of sexual desire. It is the overabundance of sexual desire to the point where you stop, like we discussed in the Inferno, when you stop seeing the other person as a valuable person and you start to just see them as a means to your end. That is when you're dehumanizing another person, when you are objectifying another person. That's lust. Okay. Now, Dante describes in this particular terrace that he must pass through a purging fire, right? He has to actually pass through kind of a burning sensation to kind of literally purge that lust out of him. Okay. So he does this. He goes through the fire. and then he enters into the Garden of Eden. Now, a couple things happen here. Let's take a look. At the summit of Mount Purgatory, he finds the Garden of Eden, where Beatrice meets him dressed in a white veil, a green cape, and a red dress. Now, she then reminds him of his past sins before leading him upwards to paradise. So the last stop, kind of the entranceway into paradise, is the Garden of Eden. Okay. Now, notice what is happening here. We are returning to the state of being that humans were at before they fell. So, in some sense, what we have going on here is the typical pattern that Christians will usually articulate is the pattern or the structure of human salvation, which is, we started here, which is at Eden. We then fell. Our nature was corrupted and all this kind of stuff. And now what is happening in our relationship with God is that we are coming back up to the point where we were at Eden, but we're actually rising more and more and more and coming actually closer to God afterwards. So that's essentially what Dante is depicting here. That's why, going back to our question on the structure of purgatory, I think that's why he has Eden here. It's not just a mere symbol of, needing to pass through the perfected state that we were in Eden, right? Getting past the archangel that's guarding the gates of Eden. I think it's more in line with that structure that I just articulated, which is that you are now back to the more pure set of your nature that was there in Eden. But now we are actually going to continue to ascend, which brings up a whole other question about theology of wait a minute, so does that mean that Adam and Eve were actually going to continue to get even better and better and better, and they might have eventually actually eaten the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil under God's command? Actually, yeah, that's actually there's a whole tradition about that in religious understanding, is that actually God was going to eventually allow them to eat the apple. It's just don't eat it now, or the fruit. Don't eat it now, though. The process is still taking place, instead of trying to disobey him and grasp at it. So that's what Dante is doing here, I think, right? And this is the last stop before we then ascend into purgatory. And unfortunately, this is also where we lose Virgil. Virgil has to stay behind at this point because he is a pagan, right? He hasn't fully received the revelation of Christ and God, all this kind of stuff. That's part of it too. That's not a total condemnation of Virgil. It's kind of just, again, Dante showing through metaphors and symbolism that yes, I am limited. You need someone who is fully close to God and fully, in the religion, in the whole world of the revealed truth of Catholicism to kind of bring you to that point. I, as a mere pagan, as a mere virtuous pagan, cannot do all that. So it's not saying, I don't think it's Dante saying, oh my God, all the pagans are in hell. I think it's a simple reflection, a metaphorical reflection, a symbolic depiction of who can guide you to sanctity the most, who can guide you the closest to joy and life and love and all this kind of stuff. Some people will be able to do it more than others, and someone like Virgil does not have the full truth, as the Christians would say, of revelation. So it has to be Beatrice, okay, or Beatrice, as we could call her. Now, the questions for purgatory. Let's take a look. There's only two. Consider the structure of Dante's Mount Purgatory. What enduring issue does this reflect from mythology and literature? Well, we talked about this with pride, right? It's that at the base of this whole purging system needs to be pride. That is the root of your sins. That is the foundation stone of all of your dysfunction, essentially, and that needs to be removed first before we can move on with anything else. Sure. Now, where might you spend a spa day on Mount Purgatory? I love that. And I'll leave the comments open for that. Where do we suspect we would fall in purgatory? I never like asking my students, hey, where do you land in hell? It's nah, we don't. I like to be at least more sympathetic, right? We're all under the age of 20 here. We haven't done anything too horrifying yet. So where do you think you struggle with? Which sin do you think you struggle with the most in the mountain of purgatory, and why? Go ahead and tell us that. And by the way, Catholics, again, to point out Dante's beliefs here, he would say that everyone, in some sense, has to pass through purgatory to some degree, right? It's only the most crazy people who are sanctified in the medieval mindset and in the apostolic era of the Bible that were able to go right through purgatory. But the vast majority, if not the overwhelming majority, of human beings have all 7 deadly sins and need to be purged of them to some degree. So which one are you going to have to spend the most time in while you are visiting purgatory? Okay, go ahead and tell us that. Now, Paradise. Okay, same thing. Direction, place, shape. What's up with paradise? Okay, finally, we get into heaven. We get into Paradiso. Now, what actually is going on here? The structure of paradise is a series of spheres surrounding the Earth based on a geocentric model of the universe. Okay. So there's a lot of discussion in Dante, by the way, of what is the significance of the place and all this kind of stuff, the placement of the planets and the placement of these spheres and all that jazz, which, by the way, ladies and gents, brings up a really interesting topic in the medieval mindset, and it's the topic of astrology and how we are meant to understand astrology. Astrology is not meant to be a tool of divination in the medieval mindset. Again, because the church and the religious traditions of the medieval era did enjoy astrology, as I'm about to explain it here, not as a tool for divination and telling the future and predicting our inevitable fates. That's not what they liked. They liked using it as a sort of extension of God's creation and God's universe that he has kind of created, and set his angels and beings in order to govern over them. So if you want more on this particular idea, go definitely read C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. I think he really focuses on that quite a bit in there. Or go read C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, or his Ransom Trilogy, I should call it, which we're going to do a video on a closer look in a little while. But we essentially see through that and through any other research you do on this topic that the medievals had this very rich, almost sort of mythological, legendary, religious idea about what the heavens really were. It wasn't space, right? It wasn't just empty, dead space. No, it was the heavens. It was this luminous, spiritually rich place above us, in the atmosphere up there and throughout the stars. And therefore, each planet is associated with a celestial virtue, essentially a celestial being. Each planet had in the medieval idea had a governing power over it, had an angel that was governing over it, that God kind of set to help that particular one enact this motion. And our planet, of course, is, as the C.S. Lewis trilogy points out, ours was the silent planet. Ours is the one that has no good ruler to it. We have the fallen ruler. We have Satan as our ruler, unfortunately, and God has had to perform a rescue mission on us, as the Christians will say. So that's paradise. Now, well, that's a point on astrology. Now, what is the paradise structure here? Why spheres, all this kind of stuff? Well, let's talk about, again, the direction, place, and shape, and all this kind of stuff. So first and foremost, the direction. Again, we are in the upward motion here. We are further up and further in, as C.S. Lewis says. We are, going closer and closer and closer to the ultimate source of all being and reality, which is God. Now, the place, again, why in the spheres, why in the celestial atmosphere? Because it is a place, like I was just describing, of more luminous life, of more stuff, essentially, more grandeur, more glory. They would not like this notion of empty space, of dead space, of dark matter, all this kind of stuff. No, they would say, no, look at it. It's amazing. It's luminous. It's vibrant. It's all this sort of beautiful stuff. Now, the shape is what I was kind of more interested in here. It is concentric what? Spheres. Okay. So not concentric, technically, kind of orbiting spheres. But why a sphere? Because at this point we are in a higher dimension, right? We are talking about three-dimensional objects that have all the other dimensions underneath them, built into them. So there is more solidity, more reality here. This is true reality. This is the real world in some sense, and therefore implying what we experienced on Earth is less real, is missing parts of these dimensions, right? We are not able to kind of perceive and inhabit and experience these other dimensions. But now that we get here, now we can. Now we kind of see, okay, this is kind of what's going on here. And if I'm remembering correctly, again, Dante is not trying to say, oh, yes, when we die and go to heaven, you're going to kind of sit in one of these planets, one of these rooms. It's not what he's saying at all. And even in this actual poem, he has, I think, an angel or Beatrice say to him, which one of the people that he's discussing this stuff with in the poem says, like, all that you're seeing here is just a is essentially just a vision that we are giving you, because we can't even show you kind of how we are really all in communion together. So there is no division really. We are just showing you kind of like the different orders that we, inhabit or who we embody. But there is no division here. So it's like, even as we get into this particular section of the Divine Comedy, it gets trippy. It gets really hard for us to comprehend what he's talking about. And Dante does that on purpose. He says, I can't even explain, I can't even perceive what it is that I'm seeing here. And again, that goes back to a very biblical idea, a very, traditional religious idea, which is that the heavenly realm, nirvana, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, it is difficult for us, if not impossible for us, to describe with our limited experience, our limited perceptions, and our limited language. Okay, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, go like listen to the near-death experiences that people, report having. It's the same kind of thing. Is that we just can't, we don't have the tools to explain what we experience. It's very mystical. Okay, so the spheres here. What do we got to do? We got to talk about the sphere, who resides there, and what is the moral teaching that Dante is being given in these spheres. Okay, so it's not just like, oh, we're trying to show you how to purge your sins. We're showing you, what the symbolic metaphor is of the punishment here, but it's like, what actually are you being taught? What is it that Dante is meant to be taught here? Okay, so the moon, right, is the first one we look at. Here rest the souls of the righteous and good who made vows but were unable to keep them. They were somewhat inconsistent. Okay. So you're righteous, you're virtuous, you're a good person. You make vows, but you're not able to be entirely consistent with them, right? You're a little bit changing, right? And that's the whole structure of the changing and waning, waxing and waning moon, right? So that's pretty easy there. Now, what's going on here, and what Dante essentially learns, is essentially just that you can still be in heaven, you can still reside here in paradise, even if you fall short of your vows, even if you have set a standard for yourself, you set a vow for yourself, and you try to live up to it and you fail, you're still going to be, here. It's kind of like the shoot for the moon, you'll land in the stars sort of thing. So great little lesson there, great little beautiful image there. And again, Beatrice is the one kind of guiding him through all this, and she becomes more luminous and luminous, by the way, as he passes through these different spheres of heaven. In Mercury, okay, what do we see? Dante finds the souls of the ambitious who sought glory on earth. These souls appear dim and overshone by the presence of the sun. Okay, so people who are desiring glory, people who want to seek some glory on earth. They want to kind of do great things, do good things, and seek a lot of virtue. It's great. Like you should try to be ambitious towards virtue in that sense. But the point here, I think that Dante is making, is that you will always be overshadowed by someone, whether it's the sun, which I think is in this particular section just kind of meant to metaphor to symbolize not just more virtuous people, more virtuous beings, but even just God. Like there's always going to be something that is greater than you, and you can be content with that. That's fine. That's totally fine. And you can even take joy in that someone else is so much better than you. How greater is that person? Look how awesome it is. And meanwhile, you're trying to be as best as you can be as well. So that contentment is what he's trying to teach you there. Then we go to Venus. In Venus, he says it's home to those souls who had great love for God and man, but were lacking in some virtue of temperance, right? Being able to temper and kind of control their passions and their love. Dante finds romantic lovers and passionate souls. Again, showing that, yes, we know that this is something that people struggle with, that people, really have, and it's a good thing. So this is in some sense kind of like a mirror of what we saw in the lust terrace of Purgatory, and why lust is the closest actually to God, the closest sin to God. And the reason for that is because it is the closest to love, right? It is like, it's love and passion that we have within us, and the desire for intimacy, the desire for love, and the desire for, to not be alone. It's that's fundamentally driving lust and love. And it's like, so there's a lot of sympathy, I think, is what he's saying here for that. And we're not meant to punish, people who are not able to always be temperance, be able to be temperate and have self-control, but we can still be a virtuous and sanctified person even with that. Okay. The sun, then. Okay, we actually go to the sun, the sphere of the sun. Amidst the sun, Dante meets the souls who were wise in life. He meets Franciscans and the Dominicans. And this is in a really beautiful lesson he's learned here. He learns here. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were sort of opposing groups in the Catholic religion during Dante's life and during the medieval period. They had different philosophies on how to um, approach the world and approach their religious calling. The Dominicans wanted a lot of study and a lot of prayer and a lot of like focus on academics, whereas the Franciscans were much more about charity and outward help of the poor and all this kind of stuff. Now, what you have in heaven here in paradise is a situation where the Dominicans are actually praising the Franciscans and kind of giving them a lot of charity and a lot of charity in their words and charity in their attention, and flattery. Well, not flattery, that's not the right word to look at it. They're basically being courteous, right? If they're showing a lot of courtesy towards the Franciscans, whereas the Franciscans turn around and say, "Oh, let me tell you how great the Dominicans are. They do all this great stuff." So what Dante is learning there is that you're able to see that you should have respect and love and not adoration, not to that level, but at least severe respect and even yes, love for people who are different than you and people who might oppose you in some way. So the example for this that I love to give my students is like, wouldn't it be great? What would we see nowadays if we wrote a modern Divine Comedy? It would be the Democrats and the Republicans. You would see, a bunch of Democrats up here saying, well, let me tell you how wonderful the Republicans are and how great they are and all this kind of stuff. Here's all their virtues. And then the Republicans will say, no, let me tell you about all the virtues of the Democrats. And it would be like, whoa, it's so foreign to us sometimes. But yeah, that's what Dante is seeing here. Okay, Mars, right? The Marshall planet, the one associated with war. What do we have here? Here, Dante sees the souls that died for their faith, that is, martyrs and warriors. Souls are acclaimed as warriors of the faith and formed together in the shape of a cross. Okay, again, the moral lesson here is kind of really showing the sanctity of self-sacrifice, of giving up your life for someone else, for the faith, for martyrdom, for all this kind of stuff, and hence the presence of the cross is, emblematic of that sacrificial virtue in Christianity. Okay, and kind of inspiring Dante to, be self-sacrificial in his love. So Jupiter, what do we see here? The one associated with Zeus, by the way, in the mythology. That's why we have an eagle, partially. Here, Dante finds the souls of the greatest earthly rulers. King David and others reside here and reveal a phrase in the sky that says, "Love justice, ye that love the earth," which is transformed into a great shape of an eagle, right? The kind of eagle, kingly, heavenly figure that, you do get a little bit of from the Greek mythology that I think he's referencing here, but again, connecting it with also the kings in the Old Testament and even in the contemporary medieval culture. And this phrase, "love justice, ye that love the earth," is basically the moral teaching here is that justice is the great virtue that kings and rulers need to embody and need to enact. You must be just, you must be fair, you must make sure that justice reigns in your kingdom, right? That is the flip side of God's love and mercy. God is also just. God wants things to be as fair as possible. Okay, so Saturn. We're going up now. Dante finds the contemplative monks who spent their lives in contemplation and exemplifying temperance. Here, Beatrice is especially loved and praised for her temperance. So here we really praise what some people struggled with lust and in the sphere of Venus, of love, which is that you need to have self-control. You need to be able to control your passions and your desires. And that's, of course, why we have monks here, these people who are very, very contemplative and very, very self-sacrificial, and ascetic is the word for it, have practiced asceticism, which is the denial of earthly pleasure, essentially. Okay. So interesting point here. We come to the fixed stars. Now, the fixed stars, the constellations, these are the places in the spheres of heaven, or those places in the heavens where Dante and the medievals would have thought these stars are set. They do not move, right? Conceptually. So here Dante finds the great saints Peter, James, and John, and the Virgin Mary, who questioned Dante, who kind of like quizzed Dante on faith, hope, and love. Dante turns to see the earth and the stars, and he gives us this passage we'll read in a minute. But notice what Dante is able to kind of see here. He's able to kind of, if we go back, he's able to see all of the places he's been from this spot right here, okay, where the stars are, this fixed stars. So he sees all the spheres he just passed through, and he sees Earth, and he sees Purgatory, and he sees hell. And I like in my class, if I can put this on like a big board, I like to show my class, look at the comparative size between these different realms. What is the smallest realm in reality? It's hell. Hell is this tiny little spot right here. That's where Satan is. Okay, tiny little spot there. Whereas just the first sphere of heaven is bigger than all of hell. Okay. And I bring us back to this because, as Dante is going to kind of understand, all the things he was concerned about with hell, like all the politics, all the things with Florence that we didn't really discuss, but it's definitely in there. He basically realizes here that it's like that's an earthly concern, right? That is a such a narrow concern in the big picture, right? This is kind of like where you get that phrase from in some sense, right? The big picture. Look at the big picture, Dante. But you're also seeing what we discussed at the beginning of the Inferno, which is this notion of the smallness of hell, the smallness of evil, the way in which evil and sin and dysfunction diminishes you, and the way that life is associated with reality. And so, what I usually quote here is I think we referenced it last time, is C.S. Lewis's sort of retelling of the Divine Comedy in his book, The Great Divorce, where someone, I think, in the story says, "Oh, so heaven is just a state of mind," and the teacher, the Virgil figure in that story, corrects the narrator and says, "No, that's completely wrong. Hell is a state of mind because in hell you are trapped in your own mind. That's the only place where hell is." And in that particular depiction of it, it's the same as in Dante, where hell is like literally like a shrunken little crack in the floor, on this immense valley and mountain range of heaven. And same thing in Dante. And then they flip the quote, by the way, and say, no, that's what hell is. Heaven is just reality itself. It is all of reality, together. So beautifully depicted from both Dante and C.S. Lewis is this notion that all religions would agree with, is that if you are, reaching the level of sanctity, reaching the level of enlightenment and of life and of goodness and truth and all this kind of stuff and love, you will understand that it's all of the world, it's all of reality. You'll have a greater understanding of all things, whereas those of us who are the farthest from those things are essentially trapped within our own mind and have no conception of the truth about reality. And then again, Dante, I think conceptually there is drawing on the Gospel of John, which we talked about last time we discussed Christianity, which is essentially the idea that light comprehends darkness, darkness cannot comprehend light. There's a fundamental illogic and there's a fundamental ignorance that is the characteristic of evil, essentially, which we see here. Okay, so what does Dante say? He says, "My eyes turned through all the seven spheres and saw this globe in such a way that I smiled at its scrawny image. I approve that judgment as best, which holds this earth to be the least, and he whose thoughts are set elsewhere can truly be called virtuous." In other words, he's saying, those of us who are most fixated on heaven and the heavenly realm and it's achieving kind of a heavenly state of being, those are the people who do the most actually for earth, who have the fullest comprehension of reality. It's not a dichotomy. It's not like the Gnostics in the ancient Greek traditions who try to completely forget about the world and think about only spiritual things. Again, this is a Judeo-Christian religion which says the world, matter, being is all good. Anything that is against it is less being, is less existence, right, essentially. So Dante therefore says, if you really do love heaven, if you really are obsessed with heaven, you want to get to heaven, you want to achieve whatever you want, whatever phrase you want to use that in that sort of sequence, you will do the most for earth, right? You will, include earth. Earth will kind of be within your joys and your attention and your love as much as heaven will. Whereas you can see the sequence. If you are only focused on earth, you will get nothing essentially. Like you get like not even any of the heavenly kind of realities, the heavenly joys that you otherwise would get. Okay. So fantastic stuff there. The premium mobile. So what is this? The final sphere of the physical universe. Dante sees God as a point of light surrounded by 9 rings of angels. He learns that all things are moved by God from beyond this physical world. Okay, so this is kind of like the edge of reality, right? The premium mobile and the Empyrean, as you're going to see in a minute, are the border of the physical world. Okay, what does he see here? What does he learn here? It is essentially that who's behind it all, right? Who's behind the physical world? It's God, right? God's reality exists through, in, and beyond the physical world. Now, he of course comes through the premium mobile, through the Empyrean, and he meets God. He actually has a vision of God. Now, what is this vision? Okay, very interesting. We have a whole couple sequence of questions about this one. So, real quick. So, yeah, why is God? It's just one question, really. Why is God in the place that he is in this form that he is in? Why is Dante unable to describe God fully? Let's take a look. So, God. Dante sees the heavenly form of God and cannot express what he saw. It should be period, right? It should be just that's it. He can't express it. Why? Because our limited perception cannot comprehend something as grand, as infinite, as fundamental, and as, overwhelmingly amazing as God. Okay. But what he sees, he has some, form of a vision. What is it, this vision? He sees three rings and the figure. Oh, okay. So if I don't remember correctly, but I don't think he fully I don't think he names him as Christ in the middle, but we have to know, we have to understand that it's Christ. So he sees, as we kind of see here, three rings, three circles, three spheres, which he perceives as rings. And each one is described as like, I think one is like rainbowish in its color, one is like fire, one is like pure light, and they all kind of like radiate off of each other and they kind of like reflect back at each other. And then at the center, he sees, again, I don't remember exactly if he says that it's Christ, but it's described as like a face that looks like, a human face, and it looks like a being that he recognizes essentially. It's a beautiful depiction of the Trinity, obviously, of the Trinity and God and all this kind of stuff. But I love that, like we discussed when we were discussing the Trinity, that kind of like very trippy, like multi-dimensional thing we can't understand. Dante gives this, very poetic and very aesthetic depiction of that very trippy and very difficult to understand concept. Now, let's look at the passage here. I think this is the very last passage of the Divine Comedy. Like sudden lightning scattering the spirits of sight, so that the eye is then too weak to act on the other things it would perceive. Such was living light encircling me, leaving me so enveloped by its veil of radiance that I could see no thing. But already my desire and my will were being turned like a wheel, all at one speed, by the love which moves the sun and all the stars. Okay, famous last lines of the Divine Comedy. So what does he see? He experiences this vision, and he experiences light essentially encircling him and radiating around him and through him. And he sees, or he feels, that his will, which the ancients would call the heart, right? He feels his heart being turned like a wheel, being moved, being guided by this light, this same light, which he identifies as the love, is this which moves all the other spheres and stars of the world. So in other words, at the core of reality, he senses God's love, which is the energy, which is the driving force behind all of creation. It's love. My love is that is God's love is moving Dante. That same love is turning the world. That same love is guiding the stars. That same love is guiding people. It's all that kind of stuff. So it's this beautifully poetic sort of ending to this grand story, this grand journey, this grand comedy. Now, what actually is questions we have to answer here? We talked about the culture's view of women. What can we infer about this culture's view of women, and why, and those we disagree with. So women and people we disagree with, right? So the women thing we discussed already. We talked about how the medievals, at least in their art, right, definitely valued women. They really liked the figure of women. There's counterexamples, I know, but we see, at least in the Catholic culture, an extreme veneration of the female feminine figure. Okay. We also see And also, by the way, it seems to be closer to virtue than other beings, right? I always like to remind the Catholic students and other students that it's like, according to the Catholics, the greatest human being is Mary, right? The most perfect human being is Mary. You can exclude Jesus technically from that list because Jesus is God and human, but like the best purely human being is Mary. So is a woman, right? So make of that what you will about Christianity's relationship with the feminine and this culture's understanding of the feminine. Now, those we disagree with, right? So like the Dominican and the Franciscans, it's that we should love them, right? We still have to love those we disagree with. We should still be courteous, right? We shouldn't have this division, this kind of tribal hatred of each other, right? We should find unity and find common courtesy with each other. Now, number 4, it's a tough one. Why is God in the place that he is and in the form that he is? Why does Dante unable to describe God fully? So number 1, or part 1 of this question. Why is God in the place that he is in? He is. So he's beyond the world, right? Well, because, guys, think back to our discussions of philosophy, our discussions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God does exist in some sense separate from all of creation, all of the universe, all of reality as we know it, right? So it's kind of like created reality, and then there's God, right? So he has to be kind of separate from that in some degree. However, at least from this particular religion's point of view, he's not just separate from it, he also permeates it. He also is immanent in his creation, right? And in the form of Jesus, at least, he also was directly physically involved in it as well. So that's, I think, why Dante does this. Now, why the form, right? Why this kind of like random form? Why is he unable to describe it? It's because, like, how do you describe the form of something that is spiritual? How do you describe the form of a spirit? So I like the symbol of the 3 rings. I think that's very obviously meant to be the Trinity. But is it actually rings? Is it 3-dimensional? Is it spheres? We can't tell, and they're kind of like reflecting in on each other. So it's like these concentric kind of 3 circles that kind of overlap and circle and embody each other. That's, again, I think, a really cool geometrical depiction of the Trinity, where we can't. It's definitely 3 things, but it also looks like one thing essentially. It's one unified thing, but there's 3 things within it. It's such an interesting way to depict this in a poetic. Okay, and of course, why is he unable to describe it fully? Because it's God, because it's the highest thing that we could comprehend, or that we could ever, hope to get close to and try to comprehend. So he does his best, in that sense. Okay, so that, ladies and gentlemen, in very short terms, is a quick skim over of Dante's Divine Comedy. I hope that you're able to at least get some insight as to the philosophy that was kind of driving the culture behind this particular era of the medieval period of history. Now, when we move forward now, we're going to enter into kind of the years after the 1400s, which are going to be labeled as the Renaissance, the Renaissance, the revival, the rebirth. And we're going to discuss Protestantism. We're going to discuss some of the major authors of this particular period. We're going to discuss some of the major rulers of this particular period. And it's a little bit of a shorter unit, but we'll get into it. And that is traditionally where we end the humanities for my 9th graders, but I've added on for 10th graders and for 9th graders who are looking for extra credit, I've added on 2 more units. So we'll do those as well. But this is the end of our medieval unit. It's a little bit longer than I expected because there's a lot to talk about in the medieval era. So hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time when we discuss the Renaissance. Have a fantastic day in the meantime. Bye.